1989, but being human, we have tried to ignore the historic obstacles that we've also had towards making democracy and democratic values of great importance all across the country. And I'm going to say this very boldly. One of the confusions of our time is the fact that we have a great number of people who were petty tyrants in 1776. What James Mason called the petty tyrant in 1776, 1787. And we still have those petty tyrants that we haven't really confronted with their tyranny. And the problem is that that petty tyranny has become larger and larger, especially in the 20th century into the 21st century. So the AP business of the Associated Press business of the phone calls, of the phones that have been requested, or the millions of phones that are being listened to by various agencies, or the millions of emails that are being read daily by federal agencies, the CIA or the FBI or the military intelligence. That should be in the press, you see, at the same time that they talk about the AP phone calls, because that's where the tyranny in our nation is continuing to come together and will one day overwhelm us without, I maintain, nonviolent struggle. So, an accumulative effect which has shifted the history of our country in a very real way, as well as a lot of different kinds of details. Where is Vicky now? Now, you wanted to have a break.
Yes, should we have now?
Yeah, well, let's wait for 15 minutes, if you don't mind. Let's do that. I'll move on quickly.
No rush.
I want to define now nonviolence and nonviolent conflict, because it is badly misunderstood. Of course, we're a culture of violence. We have great confidence in guns and bombs and drones in the United States by all sorts of people. So let me take a moment now and shift gears and simply talk about nonviolence. It is a 20th century term. That's the first thing I want to say about it. It was coined by Gandhi around 1906 in South Africa after his first resistance movement that he organized among Indian immigrants in South Africa, Pretoria and elsewhere, against the British and the Dutch empires that were creating the whole fabric of repression of Indian immigrants. And after his first resistance movement, he writes in his own papers, 1942, Nonviolence in War and Peace, that I coined the term nonviolence to capture the meaning of the ancient term that he heard as a child, ahimsa. Ahimsa, a Hindu concept meaning non-injury or do no harm to, is how it's been interpreted for 2,000 or 3,000 years. When Gandhi met these issues in South Africa, he knew he was going to he wanted to resist. But he also remembered Jainism in his childhood, from his mother especially, and from a nanny who helped to raise him, that while wanting to resist, he also wanted to respect life and its sacredness, and that he also did not want to imitate the wrong that he was experiencing. He had a kind of common sense common sense, intuition, that if he imitated this repression that he felt from the Boer Dutch British government, if he imitated that, he would not be solving the problem. He would be, as he later came to say, escalating the problem. He would be multiplying the wrong. And that in part came from this sort of inside sensibility that Jainism, as practiced by his mother especially, had a point of wisdom that he should not let go of. He should hold on to it as he tried to experiment with resistance. He did not like the term passive resistance, which he did begin to use. He was aware of the women's suffrage movement in Great Britain that talked about non-resistance. And that movement around the end of the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, used sabotage, because they would throw stones, they would light fires, they would wrestle with the police when they were arrested. And he didn't quite like what he read about and what he heard about there. So he didn't like that term, non-resistance. And so he fundamentally translated ahimsa into the term nonviolence. And he recognized for many people this would be a negative term, but he said in his writings, it's not a negative term. It tries to lift up the power of love. And he calls nonviolence, therefore, the most powerful force that the human race has and knows about. A force even more powerful than electricity or than ether, are part of his actual words back in the early 30s, 1930s. So nonviolence is a 20th century concept by Gandhi. And Gandhi read extensively. He knew about such things as strikes and boycotts and marches and meetings and agitation of all sorts. And then in his 50 years of experimenting, Gandhi pulled all of this together under what he called a science, a social science, the science of nonviolent resistance, nonviolent conflict. And his 50 years gives overwhelming evidence that will be recognized one day generally as a social science of how you bring about positive human change in social scenery. So later on in South Africa, he wanted to go further to find another word, and he did a contest, and out of that contest he brought together the word satyagraha, and meaning soul force, which he liked, and which he used along with the term nonviolence for the rest of his days. So soul force, nonviolence are words that we need to put into our own English literature and recognize that the source is Gandhi. That while strikes occurred long before 1930, Gandhi saw the strike as a nonviolent tactic. He's the one who put the term on it. In fact, the strike has its first written notation in 1170 in Egypt, 1170 BCE, in the literature of Egypt, in labor employer relationships there. The first strike recorded. So a strike is, from Gandhi's perspective, a nonviolent tactic. Now, nonviolence is increasingly being examined by a relatively small group of scholars around the world. I want to add just one other name to that, and that is the name of Gene Sharp, who was the founder of the Albert Einstein Institute some 30 years ago in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Gene has written the classic document called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. The Politics of Nonviolent Action. That will be the classic document in my judgment for decades to come. Gene spent some 25 or 30 years studying this. He spent rather his whole lifetime, 50 years. We are the same age. He spent more than 50 years studying this out of Oxford, Europe, United States. He's a boy from Ohio originally. In that book, he has classified 198 tactics of nonviolence. You could say 198 weapons of nonviolence, 198 actions that can be done, that have been done by people across 4,000 years of written history to the best of our knowledge. 198. And he's classified these further, and you can see that book. And he has done, in my judgment, what Gandhi asked and said had to be done, that the scholars would come along that would do the real study of this and would begin to put it in a form where more people could read and more people could capture both the history and the philosophy and then the tactics and strategies of nonviolence. Now, part of the purpose for us this morning is to try to help you see nonviolence as a social science of social change. And I would put on that this theme, that in the United States today we have more activist people and activist concerns than we ever had in the 1940s or the 1950s, even into the 1960s. And that activism today is more comprehensive. It has dotted the dots so that it sees many of the relationships among the different kinds of issues that we're talking about. But that activism lacks a strategic perspective. That is, it lacks the understanding of nonviolent conflict so that it would help the activism to shape the politics that can really forge the changes that millions of people in this country want. The electoral politics does not have that capacity. It's managed by money and the parties. It's managed by the states that then run the elections. So electoral system is not reflective of the wills or the wishes of the American people, and perhaps, at least in my lifetime, never have these been reflective of the will of the people. It will take nonviolent politics that wakes up people, helps people to recognize their links to one another, that can help to produce the different kinds of politics that we need. That did the job in the 60s to a limited extent, did the job in the middle of the century in terms of working families, and that has to redo the job. The issue, of course, here is that people who want freedom, equality, can never rest. That's the reality. And every generation has to learn that and build upon it. Because no society has attained the great, vast potential that we of the human race have for life. No society has attained that. I want to start off by trying to define a couple of things that was raised by Jeff Warner at the break. And they're very, very important questions, and I had not come to them yet, but I want to consider that question. Let me begin this by saying that nonviolence and pacifism are not the same thing. I began to learn that in 1947 as a freshman in college in Ohio, near Cleveland, Ohio, Baldwin Wallace College, as I began to explore the Fellowship of Reconciliation and pacifism and all. I learned from that pacifism was in a serious conversation with perhaps a major theological voice at that time, Reinhold Niebuhr, who said that pacifism was a form of trying to be pure and holy and not acknowledge the role of sin in the world and in human life. But the second thing he said was that whether the pacifist movement understood it or not, they were engaged in power, and that power and its use was always ambiguous. And many pacifist voices at that time said that pacifism is love that says you cannot therefore kill. And the pacifist movement is largely a movement in the Western world that grew out of Christianity, of the people who said that Jesus had an absolute critique of violence. And I'm of the mind with Niebuhr, though I'm very much critical of him in many ways, wrote my first essay criticizing him as a freshman in college. A know-it-all against a weighty theologian of the church. Anyway, I agree with him about power. Love does have power. I realized this by the time I was a freshman in college, a high school student even, because I was fortunate enough to be birthed into a pastor's home, a second-generation pastor in Pennsylvania, and my mother and father were deeply committed to the way of love. Way of love as personified in Jesus, but also as they understood to be the major characteristic of God. And that impacted my life at a very, very early age. It was a powerful force in my life from my birth. Looking back, I've recognized that for 7 decades or more. So love is power. It's not just persuasive. It's not just influential. It is a form of power. And I was helped there by discovering Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, ancient philosopher, and the wisdom of Aristotle, who defined power in this way. He wrote, "Power is the capacity to effect purpose." Power is the capacity to effect purpose. So, a newborn baby begins to wiggle her fingers, struggles from inside to open her eyes, begins to move the hand, the toes, the legs, the arms. That is the power of life in them. It's more than any kind of instinct. It is a driving force that moves them to work in such a fashion. I'll use the term work because it's the infant's initial capacity to work, to accomplish and effect the purpose of their discovering their hands, their body, their movements, to crawl, to stand, to feed themselves in the rest of their journey. So I like sometimes to say that power is a given from creation that each person has. And that what does sometimes often happen is that in our being raised in our societies, we are disempowered. rather than taught to appreciate power as the capacity to effect purpose. Whether it's learning how to write, or to use a fork, or to walk, or to run, or to toss a basketball, all of that is power. Nonviolence, violence rather, is the abuse of power. Violence uses power to intimidate, to harass, to dominate, to injure, to destroy persons or persons in order to impose your will on them. So power, the violence is a use of power that is an abuse of God-given power. The science of nonviolence is making the effort, has made the effort across many years to effect purpose without intimidation, without harassment, without injuring, without destroying, without devastating, without dominating. So we in the United States have a very loose understanding of violence because we have been for so many years such a culture of violence that we don't realize that it is a use of power, and that it is a power that seeks to injure and hurt and intimidate and harass rather than the use of power for the purpose of helping people discover their equality, their liberty, their justice, their truth. So those two definitions. And I don't say that in the United States, where strikes and boycotts have been used across, well, from the 17th century even, I don't say that in some of these instances they have not been violent in their use. But the way in which Gandhi has talked about nonviolence, and the way even in our own country the anti-slavery movement talked about some of their demonstrations, non-resistance, we try to take these tactics and use them in a powerful way by which you can have conflict and you can move through conflict, sowing the seeds for the reconciliation then and down the road. And so, for example, in terms of the United States, in terms of the nonviolent movement of America, 1955 onward, you can say that one of its effects was that some people began the process of transformation of their lives. Many people in the movement itself, out of largely the black community, discovered a new sense of what it is to be alive and what it is to be a human being. King even talked about, in Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, King and others in that movement talked about the new Negro, because they noticed people walking to school, walking to church, walking to work daily for 381 days. And he writes in his little book, The Stride Toward Freedom, that many of us began to notice that it looked as though Negro was walking with a new personal strength. Their back straighter, their heads